Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. Ben is back with us again for this episode. This episode is filmed 5 minutes after the last one. You can tell that we batch our videos here, but we are still out at this stormwater treatment system, where in the last episode, we looked at some maintenance that council has done recently. The system had established really well, had been left for a little while, weeds had got in, and council had really had a choice. They could have sprayed herbicide, but it would have been a problem because they would almost certainly have killed a bunch of the other desirable plants. They didn't spray herbicide, but they did come in and brush cut out the weedy grasses, which, as we talked about, was probably the better of those two options, but still problematic for a few reasons. And this, for us, is a topical situation. We've talked about this a little bit recently.
Yep.
And we want to use this episode to dig into, okay, if the two most commonly used tools in this space for weed management and for veg management have both got their downsides, like, what's the alternative? What should we be doing? So we're going to need to, this is going to be a chat, this is going to be like not a definitive, hey, here is something you should be doing or shouldn't be doing. This is a conversation type episode where we're going to try and dig into it and see what comes of it. So why don't we go back up to the top of this problem essentially and go, we're talking weed management. What makes a weed a weed? Because we came out today fundamentally because we were like,
to talk this through.
To talk this through, because I'd previously been making episodes and just implicitly had this assumption in them that, you know, something that I didn't perceive should be there was a weed and should go. But an understanding of what makes a weed is a little bit more nuanced and a bit deeper than that.
It is nuanced.
So let's get into it. Where should we go to dig into this?
I think starting, well, for me, the first introduction that I had to a weed was when I was training to be a bushland ranger, which never happened, by the way.
The training never happened, or you never became a ranger?
The training definitely happened, but the ranger thing didn't, and I'm happy with where I am.
Because you went into ecology, and then and then someone roped you into stormwater management.
Don't know how that happened. But
okay, so you were training to become a bushland ranger.
I was doing a conservation and land management certificate at TAFE. I went on to do the diploma, and part of that training involved some courses in weed management. And a little bit of context about that program. Once upon a time, because I don't think it's as common now as it was, it was sort of the prerequisite for weed management. A lot of environmental service operators that specialise in vegetation management, and in particular weed management, they required their employees, or their soon-to-be their tentative employees, to have this training. So it was sort of the authority, which means that the definition that I was exposed to at that point, a lot of people probably have that same idea in mind, and that is, and I think we'll find that it's very common actually, is that it's just a plant that we deem doesn't belong in. So
a weed is a plant that is somewhere that we have deemed it not to belong.
This is right, which in my view it exposes it to an enormous amount of nuance.
So let's give some examples. Can we just give some tangible examples of this?
Of course.
So in my veggie garden, if my turf grows up between the sleepers and gets into it, it's a weed. Because I don't want turf in the veggie garden.
It's undesirable for you.
Similarly though, if somehow, if I accidentally drop one of my cherry tomatoes that I grew in the veggie garden into a hanging basket and it pops up in amongst the ornamental plant, then the tomato is a weed. Because it's context. It's the context within which the plants are sitting that matters. Okay.
So in an agricultural context, for example, a weed would be any plant that is prolific enough to outcompete the crop and reduce the crop yield. So in that instance, it's the fact that it's competing that makes it problematic. So you could have 100 species in there that were tiny, teeny, and not making any competition. Even if you had no interest in them being there. And they probably wouldn't trigger the whole, I'm a weed. Until there's potentially there's a threat, at which point then we're like, oh, you really shouldn't be there. Or a human perceived threat. Which is another thing. But that's we might get to that later. So in the context of conservation, that will be a plant that for example, in a restoration for a restoration program. So if you're doing a revegetation project for a formerly agricultural patch of forest.
Yeah, so something's been cleared at some point
Yep.
and it's trying to be revegetated. Maybe
There's-
it's a riparian area beside a creek.
Sure.
Let's say. Yep.
They'll go through and they'll revegetate it, and to allow for those plants to establish and establish themselves and get that coverage that we want from the project or from the money that we're investing in it, we have to manage the other plants to ensure that they don't outcompete them, and usually those are weeds. Yeah.
Because we didn't want them to be there.
We didn't want them to be there.
The very fact that they're likely to outcompete the stuff that we did decide was there
Yes.
makes them a weed.
Yes.
Okay. So what does then that lead us to do? So let's narrow in on like the conservation, the natural areas management, the stormwater systems management, because those three in many respects are really quite similar.
Yep. Oh,
Let's-
yeah, absolutely.
let's narrow
There's
in
a lot
on-
of crossover.
Yeah, let's narrow in on that and say, okay, based on that definition, what does that then lead us
Yep.
to end up physically doing on the ground?
Yep.
Us collectively as the industry.
Yep.
Yeah, like what happens? So someone comes out to a system and let's say, it has been established reasonably well, either because it was a natural area, but maybe stuff's starting to get into it.
Yep.
And you're doing some management on it, or like this system here where it had been planted and established.
Yep.
With that definition of a weed, someone comes out to look after a system.
Yep.
What's likely to happen?
They're going to get rid of it.
How do they tell? So they decide it's a weed because that definition. Essentially, we have to have some essentially a preconceived notion of what should be
we'll have
there.
lists. Yep, sure.
Okay.
Yep.
And then anything that's not on our preconceived notion / list
Yep.
automatically becomes a no-no.
Yes.
And so what happens? Does it get sprayed? Does it
gets-
get brush cut? What's likely to happen?
Depending on the weed and how much it's taken over, yeah, it'll either get sprayed or it'll get brush cut or whatever weed control strategy is appropriate, I suppose. And cost effectiveness, of course, plays a part in that.
Okay.
But no, they'll come in, they might remove it mechanically, so they'll have to bring plant in to pull things down, for example, Madeira vine.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, they will remove that vegetation. The problem is though, when they're doing that, and as is the case in the last video, they do a lot of damage to the desired vegetation. And there might be a compounding problem that we'll get to in the way of dispersing seeds, damaging vegetation, and not really allowing for, or maybe just not applying the kind of view that's required, the time frame that's required to see the outcome that we desire.
Do those approaches, so if the fundamental underlying problem is that there are some plants there that we didn't desire to be there,
Yep.
does that approach fix the fundamental underlying problem? Does coming in and spraying out or slashing, as is the case here,
Yep.
those weedy species fix the fundamental underlying problem?
No.
No.
No, I would say not.
So what's the fundamental underlying problem then?
That the vegetation hasn't established.
Yeah, so
The desired vegetation hasn't. Oh, okay, I think I understand where you're going.
Yeah,
you mean
so the problems are that somehow the weeds are getting in there in the first place.
Yep.
So they've somehow been able to propagate, whether that's come in by seed or by, like either seed by air, seed through water, vegetative matter that's somehow been dropped, and some stuff could theoretically have sprung up from essentially cuttings, so to speak.
Yep.
Not actual cuttings, but you know what I'm saying. I can't think of the right word.
No, that's all right.
That's part of the fundamental underlying problem, is the weeds are able to get themselves in there, or those species are able to get themselves in there.
Yes. I think
Part of
that
part of the problem is that if they did get in there, the natives weren't able to
Yes.
outcompete them.
So I think where you're going with this is that the fundamental problem is that the system as it is now
Yeah.
isn't resilient enough
Yeah.
to
Okay.
be able to cope with those. And I think this goes to a good point. The objective here, and I think in doing anything, it's always really important to constantly have the objectives in your mind and to reflect on those objectives and your progress towards those objectives. The objective is to build, in this case, and in the case of restoring a riparian area, or not, maybe not restoring it, but It's to establish vegetation or establish a system that is resilient and that can perpetuate and can manage itself, and that doesn't require human intervention and therefore human costs.
Well, that should be the goal anyway.
Yes.
But our actions don't always match up with that, though, do they?
No, and that I think is maybe a side effect, and I used these words before of, and I don't know if I'm coining this, but institutionalized weed management.
You certainly used that term off camera several times.
Yeah,
So,
and I don't think that maybe anyway, yeah.
so what do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is that, and this goes to the point that I was trying to make about the view. The objective is that we want to establish a system, an ecosystem, and this is still really an ecosystem, or part of an ecosystem, a component of an ecosystem. We want to establish a system that is resilient, it's resistant, and that confers all of the benefits that we would expect an ecosystem to deliver, so ecosystem services, but is cost effective in the sense that it requires as minimal amount of human intervention to sustain itself.
Because the scale, it's an issue of scale here, in that if we want urban areas that actually have something that resembles nature in them, in close enough proximity so that people can actually get out and experience that
and enjoy them
easily, it's just an issue of scale, because there's just going to be so much of it that we can't possibly be intervening in an intensive manner.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the problem with, so the institutionalized like weed management is the approach of, well, let's come in and spray herbicide or brush cut to manage the weeds, and we'll be back in 6 weeks.
Yes.
And we'll do it again.
And
the problem with that is scale. Like that one of the problems actually. Because there could be others with spraying. There could be other problems there in terms of spraying heaps of herbicide into the environment. So we'll hold that as problem number 2. But fundamentally, the first one is scale, in that if we want lots of these natural or natural-esque areas in our urban areas for people to access, we just can't afford that institutionalized weed management approach.
It's a mismatch.
It just doesn't scale.
Yeah. So it's a mismatch of our effort with the objectives, I think, here.
Okay.
And I think, though, that perhaps in that institutionalized weed management idea, we lose sight of that objective in favour of the status quo. And the status quo is it's coming through in the event that there is a system that is choked with tufted grasses that have loads and loads of seed heads all over them. It's coming through, and a reactive approach to that would be to just level everything to make it look less weedy. And I think at that point, if we are applying that approach, or spraying herbicide for that matter, we have lost sight of the objective, and that is because it is uninformed of. It has to be uninformed of that ecological view, of that long-term view, that long-term objective.
Which doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't logic applied to get to that point, though, because a lot of this happens in the context of a local government, where in this instance, this got brush cut because I alerted the maintenance crews to it. And this is how a lot of this happens, in that there's a public complaint or there's a referral from another department. And because maintenance budgets aren't sufficient, so there's, 100 kilometres worth of riparian area to manage. We only have enough budget to manage 10 kilometres worth of it. So then we get a complaint comes in, whether it's from another department or from the public, and because local governments are political organisations, they tend to respond to, particularly the public complaints. They understandably respond to that and do the management. But quickly then, but potentially a more ecological approach is going to be quite a long-term approach that doesn't get a short-term response. Because local government, because local government is a political entity, a short-term response is often desired. So that lends itself to doing this sort of approach, which then locks in the institutionalized weed management, because this is going to regrow weeds in it. So then we fall into the cycle where there's going to be another request to do it, and essentially we chew up all the money doing this. So the fact that this is happening is
It
Like,
makes,
we're
it makes
sense.
sense. Yeah, it makes sense, of
Yeah,
course.
we're identifying it as a problem,
Yeah.
but we're not identifying this as a criticism of
No.
the people in the industry who are either doing the works or programming the works,
No.
because it's the system within which this is happening that's
Yep.
broken.
There are cultural dimensions here at play, of
Yeah.
course, around
Yeah.
aesthetics and what people expect, and
This everyone, in my opinion, is actually behaving in really quite a logical manner in the way we are currently responding within the system that we are working.
yeah, we're constrained.
Yeah, it
within which we're
requires a complete step change in
Mhm.
philosophy
Yep.
if we're going to do something different.
And I think that philosophy exists.
Okay.
I think that if you have any kind of background in ecology, you understand how systems work, at least in a conceptual way. And even with that conceptual understanding, you can see how problematic this is. But it's
So you're talking about looking at the options and forecasting what's going to happen several steps down the track. Is that
Oh,
what you're getting at? Or-
yeah, absolutely. But
Okay.
it's driving that change. So I think that there are people in government that have this view, but it's just driving that change. I think it's pretty hard because of that, because of those other dimensions.
So what is this alternate ecological approach? Like if you could wave a magic wand and get systems managed differently,
Yep.
what would that management look like on the ground?
I think I have a particular philosophy. I have a particular philosophy around what is a weed, or a perspective around what is a weed.
Like, we're not saying this is perfect or the right way to go, but
No.
this is for the sake of having a conversation and
Yep.
trying to look for an alternative.
Yep. Absolutely. Anything that I say should be taken with a good tablespoon of salt.
Probably followed by some vodka.
I think that applies. Well, probably with this video, yes, and I think that applies to anything that anybody says ever, actually. But I think that to get if we want an ecosystem that is resilient, it's resistant to perturbation, to disturbance. We have to understand the steps involved in getting there, and that requires an ecosystems perspective. So there is this idea of succession, which isn't an idea, sorry, it is...
It actually happens.
It actually
Succession
happens.
occurs.
Succession occurs.
We looked at that happening in Hoyland Street
This
in
is
a
right.
video some time ago. I don't know the number.
Yeah.
It was probably
but
in
go
like
back to that, actually.
about the 110 plus or minus 5 episodes
Yeah.
range. Something like that.
And I think that, ecosystems build themselves, they change themselves through stages of succession.
So succession would be, one type of plant comes up early,
Yep.
creates a canopy,
This is
lives
right.
for 10 years,
Yep.
dies
Falls
off,
over.
creates the light, and the succession is the next species coming through.
This is right. So if I had my way, which is never going to happen, but, anyway.
Never say never, man.
Never say never. I think that the kind of approaches that we take to managing weeds and these types of systems, we would more or less eradicate it. And what I would do is encourage a succession-based approach where you encourage, or maybe not eradicate entirely, sorry, there is still very much a place, there would still be a place for weed management and some of the approaches that exist now. But we would establish a canopy. This would shade out a lot of the shade intolerant species. Well, not intolerant, but species that don't, the invasive species or the weed species that don't do so well in shade.
Is there a bit of a correlation here where a lot of the time the species that are being removed as weeds are these species, they definitely grow a lot quicker than the natives.
Yep.
But they also, in order to facilitate that, they're making really good use of available resources, including sunlight.
Yeah, of course.
So if
they
you
thrive in disturbed areas.
Yeah,
as well.
so if you strip out the sunlight,
Yep.
and you take the sunlight away from them,
Yep.
it takes away part of their competitive advantage.
Yeah, we didn't touch on that. Yeah,
I'm slowly bringing this back around to that.
Okay, yeah. So, that's exactly right. So, these species are going to thrive with disturbance and the kind of approaches that we're applying. So in the last video, we talked about the consequences of this particular approach, and that's been applied in this system. And that was, dispersed seeds. We're coming in here with all of these grass, these feral, we call them feral or exotic grasses, your paspalums and whatnot, and you'll brush cut them, and because of the dispersal mechanisms for their seeds, they're going to disperse in the systems. We're assisting that process, and they will embed themselves in the seed bank, or at the surface, at the soil surface. They may find their way in eventually. that will build a seed bank. And unless a fire comes through and destroys all of it, these things have mechanisms to persist in that seed bank. And because of their life cycles and the way that they work, they'll come up a lot quicker and set seed a lot quicker than the desired vegetation, which is the melaleucas. If you can see in the system, the melaleucas, the lomandras and everything like this. And we talked about this before, Jack, when we were walking through the system just to get a kind of
in
a
the
grip
previous
on
episode. Yep.
None of the desired vegetation is seeding here. Only
We've only spread the weeds.
we've
seed
only spread the weeds.
Okay.
We've opened up light gaps.
Yep.
At least in my view, we've probably done more damage or harm than good. But as we've established, that it is not a criticism. It is just a part of the system at play.
Okay. So in this longer term succession approach, you
Yep.
establish a canopy because ultimately we want to. Which, actually, we should say this.
It is
Long term,
happening.
this is exactly what council is doing with this system, in the sense that they planted a whole bunch of melaleucas in here
And the casuarinas.
and the casuarinas around the edge.
Yep.
So longer term, that is actually where this system is heading.
Yep.
So that's a good thumbs up.
Yeah.
But in this more succession-based approach,
Yep.
you would establish a canopy, and what? In the interim, leave the weeds there.
Yep.
Well, they're weeds. Like, isn't this a problem, Ben?
This is
They're
my
weeds.
potentially contentious philosophy or perspective on what is
Yep.
a weed and
I
what
was
isn't.
setting you up to share.
Thank
this.
you, Jack. There's a lot of context here, and we could. This is a bit of a rabbit hole, so I will try to keep this as brief as possible. But we have a weed in Australia called Lantana camara, Lantana, or however you want to say it, and it is. I don't think people would argue that it's the worst weed in Australia. I think there's an argument for things like cat's claw and
But it's a pain.
Madeira,
It's a pain in the
or your
backside.
trees like your camp. Yeah, it's a pain in the backside. We probably spend quite a significant amount of money at the local government level to control this weed in favour of promoting, the desired vegetation. But in doing so, we're applying chemicals and we're brush cutting and we're doing whatever that we need to do to control it, and we're spending a lot of money. This particular plant, at least in my view, and in the absence of a biological control agent akin or as successful as the Cactoblastis moth for prickly pear, which is probably the most successful example of biological control in the world, actually. The Queensland was, and a lot of Australia was smothered in prickly pear back in the 20s and 30s, and the Alan Fletcher Research Centre, which is just outside of Brisbane here, they were tasked with finding the natural enemy of the prickly pear and bringing it here, testing it to make sure that it isn't going to have an adverse impact and outcompete other species and control it. Like I said, this is a rabbit hole.
Yep.
But anyway, very successful example. We have lantana specific herbicides, or we have tried to introduce other biological control agents to control for lantana, and I don't think, at least in my experience, that it's working, and I doubt that it ever will work.
So where we're going, and this starts to get controversial.
Yes.
At some point,
we need to draw the line.
We are suspecting that collectively, as an industry, at some point,
Yes.
we need to look at just how far down this rabbit hole does the industry go, chasing its tail of trying to stop things that we perceive to be weedy from getting established and spending huge amounts of money doing it, using fairly conventional approaches which actually don't solve the underlying problem.
No.
They remove the species but still leave favourable conditions for it to get back in.
Yeah. Just they disturb the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a system that is just trying to establish, and it just doesn't have the resilience to be able to bounce back.
Yeah. How far down this rabbit hole do we go before we go, you know what, maybe some of the negatives of what we're doing here in terms of both money spent, herbicides randomly sprayed around the environment, at what point does this not stack up? And maybe for some species that have a significant impact on agriculture,
Yes.
maybe the investment is worthwhile for some.
Yes.
But then in this context here, where we have essentially ubiquitous exotic grasses that are everywhere.
And that may be uncontrollable,
And may
realistically.
And may realistically,
Yeah.
if we really sit down and think about it, be uncontrollable.
Yeah.
At what point do we go, oh, you know what? Maybe we stop considering this a weed purely because it's an exotic
Yep.
and go, okay, is it functional in that environment?
Yep.
Because this thing is first and foremost a stormwater treatment system.
Yes.
So we could look at that and go, okay, if we can live with those exotics, like if society was to make a decision that, actually, you know what, we don't think we can ever get rid of those exotics, so let's stop just throwing good money after bad.
Mhm.
If it's only good money after bad if you make that decision. If you decide that you can control them, then it's good money after good.
Uh-huh.
But if we make that decision, then functionally at this point you'd go, okay, well, do those grasses provide a stormwater treatment benefit?
Yeah.
Do they, for example, have the root structure to keep the media porous and to perform treatment of nitrogen and phosphorus and others?
Yep.
Do they grow up in nice dense clumping mats that are going to physically filter the water and drop out sediments?
Yep.
In many respects, like those grasses that have been brush cut out of this system behind us have essentially all the same functional attributes as the Caryxes and the Lamandras that were there anyway. From a treatment point of view, those exotic grasses are almost certainly just as good.
Yep.
So if society were to make
I think this.
So if we were going to go down this approach, which is slightly more of an ecological approach, slightly society decision that some of this stuff might be manageable.
Certainly social implications here.
Yeah, then for at least from stormwater treatment systems like this, they're completely functional.
Yep.
Like it doesn't matter. You can.
If I may.
Yeah. Sorry.
If
I
we.
talked for a little.
Oh no, it's fine. If we circle back to our objective here.
Okay.
What is our objective for this system? At the design stage, what was the objective for this particular system? Let's take a long-term view of 10 to 15 years.
Well, to treat stormwater and probably look okay.
Yep. Look
Not-
okay.
Yeah, maybe not look brilliant. This park isn't really high profile.
Yep.
But look enough that it's not going to bother anyone.
Uh-huh.
So treat stormwater, look okay.
Yep.
Were probably the main. Third objective there would be not make flooding any worse.
Yeah.
Because it's a low-lying area and this area does flood.
Sure.
And then I suspect a fourth objective that they didn't deliberately think of but would consider would be important would be not introduce any weeds into the environment that we don't want to be in the environment.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
So
Those are some objectives.
Sure.
Where,
Yep.
where do
Okay.
you want to go?
Well, I think kind of you could sum that up with a system that's resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that may be a system that would establish that would treat the stormwater, would perhaps look okay, irrespective of the profile of the park, and that maybe requires as little intervention as possible. It's established and it is what it is.
Yeah.
If we're going to have that, then I think we need to apply that approach.
Okay, so I think where we're
So you have to have that objective in mind,
Yeah.
and
So
then apply the. Yeah.
So I think where we're circling around to here is that systems like this, if you took a more ecosystem-based and resilient approach, based around getting canopy up first.
Ants all over me, by the way.
Yeah, there are a bunch of ants in this park. Yep. They're not climbing on my drink bottle after this video, but if we were to take a more ecological resilience-based approach, here we would focus on get a canopy up first because it takes away one of the advantages that the weedy species currently have, and we'd get that up with the intention that in the shorter term we wouldn't wouldn't be getting in there and trying to brush cut out and spray the weeds out in any major way immediately. But for that to work, we as society essentially have to make a decision that we are relatively comfortable with. One, some of those ubiquitous weed species are in there and seeding and are probably going to pop up further down the system because it's a stormwater treatment system. Those seeds are going to wash out into the downstream waterway, which is weedy as anything downstream.
I think these were here before. But
But secondly, we also as a society need to recognise the fact that these spaces aren't going to have the beautiful landscaped aesthetic in the short term that we might want them to. Like, there's a societal decision here that not everything can be manicured. It just can't be sustained in that.
No, and that if the public was drawn to this particular view and an understanding that we may potentially be wasting a bit of money here,
a bit,
quite a lot, then they may be.
They might be interested.
They might be more. There might be a shift in perspective.
Maybe society wants landscaped areas, but I don't see a conversation happening at a broader societal level at the moment to understand that.
No, I think,
and that's understandable. There's a lot of stuff that society needs to deal with.
Yeah.
So, okay, is this a fairly good spot to wrap this up? We've kind of talked around to a logical conclusion.
Yeah, I think so. Yep. I think if we summarise it all, I'm advocating for an objectives sort of based approach, and then bringing to that an ecological perspective. So understanding the way that this system, in a conceptual sense, will go from when it's implemented to what we want, and understanding everything that could go wrong in that process, and then working up strategies to achieve that, or to achieve the desired outcome.
But that will need a shift to the system within which veg management currently works.
So aesthetics might take a back seat. Yeah,
but also the system, because the system as a whole at the moment, with the way budgeting works and the way we spend cash on this, incentivizes short-term, responsive. There was a complaint. It's not pretty. Can you guys get in and do something? Like, there's some fundamental. There's some of the architecture. There's some shifts. Local government works as a political entity and leading to maintenance and there's some stuff that needs to change to make that happen. Okay, let's wrap it up there. Ben, thank you for sitting down and having this quite long chat. We're really interested to see how long this video has ended up. But it's all good. It was a good chat. I hope that you have found this interesting, and I hope that it inspires you to get involved in this discussion, because it is a little bit controversial, but it's also important. It's important that we talk this through because of the implications of this, of the money spent, of the herbicide sprayed into the environment, of the weeds that are at stake in our environment here. So I hope this inspired you to get involved. If you would like to get involved in this conversation, there's a few ways to find us. You can find us online at ideanthro.com. We have a contact page. You can find contact details there. You can find us on YouTube, all the videos on YouTube. If you search Ideanthro, you'll find them. You can find us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Ideanthro. You can leave us a comment or send us a message there. Sweet. Thank you for tuning in. Ben, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.